Those are some of the latest headlines on C-SPAN Radio.
Washington Journal continues.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee, she is the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. I want to show our viewers a headline from last week. Black Caucus tells Obama, you've done too little for African Americans. About 10 Congressional Black Caucus members boycotted a vote in the House Financial Services Committee over these issues. The president today is outlining a speech on jobs, what he wants to do to create jobs. Specifically, what do you want to hear from him about what he'll do to create jobs for African Americans?
Sure. When you look at the unemployment rates in the African American community, they're twice that in the white community and throughout the country. And of course, our president was dealt a pretty rough hand in terms of the economy. The last 8 years, he's been doing a great job trying to figure out how to dig ourselves out. And what we're doing is working with the administration and our leadership to try to come up with a jobs bill so that we can have resources targeted to where the unemployment rates are the greatest. And we believe that if we have a jobs bill that is robust, many of us in the last stimulus package wanted $1 trillion. Of course, we couldn't get the votes for $1 trillion. So we want to see a strong, robust jobs bill that provides not only for jobs but job training, because so many people have been historically unemployed who need some opportunities now for training so that they'll be prepared for the new world, and that's the green industry, the technological revolution that's taking place, and all of those jobs that are going to be sustainable over time.
The president responded to the criticism from the Congressional Black Caucus last week, and he said this: I will tell you that I think the most important thing I can do for the African American community is the same thing I can do for the American community, period. And that is get the economy going again and get people hiring again. I think it's a mistake to start thinking in terms of particular ethnic segments of the United States rather than to think that we are all in this together and we are all going to get out of this together. What's your reaction?
First, the president is the president. We're members of Congress. We represent constituencies who are suffering. Havoc has been wreaked on their lives. And what we have to do as members of Congress is be advocates for those constituencies that had been left out. 28% of the African American community now are on food stamps. When you look at the foreclosure crisis, the financial services industry targeted minority communities, targeted the African American community and the Latino community. And so as members of Congress, we have to come up with legislative proposals to present to the president to begin to turn this around. And that is exactly what we are doing. And I believe that the president, I know he gets it. He understands he has to fix the economy for everyone. He also understands, I believe, and I'm confident of that every group in our country, every young person deserves a job, deserves adequate education, everyone deserves health care, and that we have to work very hard. But as members of Congress, we have to be very focused on our constituents and focused on those who could be left behind if we don't have a targeted response that creates some equity and some justice in these economic initiatives that we are supporting.
One of your colleagues, Maxine Waters, has put forth one of these legislative proposals in the financial regulation bill that's being considered in the House this week. And Barney Frank, the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, has signed on to the proposal, which would channel $3 billion for troubled assets relief program toward mortgage relief for jobless Americans. The measure would designate another $1 billion for a program that gives grants to state and local governments to purchase foreclosed properties and use them for more productive purposes. Does this do enough as far as what you're talking about for African Americans?
I think that's an excellent example of what we are trying to do. Congresswoman Waters chairs the Housing Subcommittee of the Financial Services Committee. Congresswoman Waters and members of the Financial Services Committee, rightfully so, are looking at strategies on how to address the economic security of African Americans, minority community, which of course means making our country stronger and helping make the economy stronger. So this is a great first step, but I think that it's an example of what we are trying to do in every area to help uplift everyone in terms of their lives. Again, as I said, the economy, as we all know, is in shambles, and it's double-digit unemployment, or twice the amount of unemployment in the Black community now and in the Latino community. So we have to target responses appropriately.
Does that mean when this bill comes to the floor that CBC members will be offering even more amendments to direct money from TARP and other areas to African American communities?
Well, on every bill that we're presented, not only in the Financial Services Committee, but in all of the committees, we're looking at how we can create job training and jobs in communities of color, in the African American communities, and throughout the country. And so each legislative measure that is coming forward, we have our agenda, the CBC's agenda. It's opportunities for all, pathways out of poverty. We look at our legislative efforts within that framework, and so on all of our bills, that's our focus, and we're determined that we're going to help the president turn this around.
First phone call comes from Betty, and on the Democrats line in Illinois. Go ahead, Betty.
Good morning. Congressman, you know this hasn't just started since President Obama been president. We've always been the last one to get jobs. That's why affirmative action was created. Thank you. And
your reaction, Congresswoman?
Well, I think there's some history here. I think the president in his speech in Philadelphia on race really laid out what some of that historical context is. But I think we have to move forward like we are. And so we're talking about creating an American dream for everyone. And we have to do that as members of Congress within our role as members of Congress to make sure that every bill that we work on, every public policy creates opportunities for all, and that's exactly what we're doing.
You talked about education and training. What did the statistics say about the level of education for African Americans and how that relates to the number of African Americans that are unemployed?
Well, first, when you look at the dropout rate in the African-American community, you look at dropout rates in urban areas with African-American young men, it's horrendous. Sometimes, and I think in some areas, for instance, in my own district, it's over 50%. When you look at the college graduation rates, when you look at the fact that fewer African Americans get jobs, and I mean the numbers are there when they have college degrees. When you look at these gaps, and I call them moral gaps in our educational system, and what happens when individuals get an education, there's still a host of measures we have to mount to begin to close these disparities, because education is the key to success in our country. And so when you look at what's taking place in terms of our urban areas with minimal resources to create good schools, there's a lot we must do to make sure we turn this around.
New York City, Tom on the Republican line.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask some questions of the Congresswoman. I've been in New York City most of my adult life, not all. I'm looking and listening to the words you say. They all sound fantastic, but the reality is your programs, the programs by and large put forward by the Black Caucus, have been an unmitigated disaster for the black community. Let's start with the fact that the black community has largely caused or supported the programs that have caused our meltdown with the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which caused our problem. Let's talk about the programs that have encouraged the breakdown of the black community. I did a tremendous amount of work with a group called New York Youth at Risk that worked with the most at-risk members of our community. The stuff that held back these kids from success in life had nothing to do with the programs you're talking about. The greatest metric you should, in fact, be focusing on is single-parent families, and that has nothing to do with government programs. It does have a moral program element, a tremendous moral program, and that is a breakdown of the morality in that community, and indeed programs that encourage that, programs that, and Hollywood did encourage that. Here's an interesting statistic for the Congresswoman. If you take away the metric that has to do with single parent, and primarily mother, of course, families across all the ethnic classes, and correlate that with incarceration, then the difference between white and black incarceration disappears. So when you look at that sort of statistic and say, see, the society is broken because of racism. No, the society is broken because of single parenthood in the black community.
All right, Tom, I think we have enough here. Ms. Lee, go ahead.
Thank you for that, sir. But let me just say, we're members of Congress. We're public policy makers. We're not members of the clergy. And so when you talk about lifestyle and morality and all of those issues, I think that belongs, and those are dialogues that we must have in our communities. But as members of Congress, it's our job and responsibility to make sure that all of our legislative efforts have opportunities for all and that no one is left behind. And that's why we have to work so hard to make sure that we close these gaps in unemployment, to make sure that the health care reform bill passes with our health disparities provisions to ensure that we begin to close these disparities. When you look at life expectancy rates, infant mortality rates in the African community, much, much greater. And so our job as members of Congress is to make sure that we have legislation and public policies that address these gross disparities and moral gaps in our country's federal public policy system.
Missouri, Ohio, Jeff on the independent line.
Good morning. Happy to get through. Congressman or Congresswoman Lee, many times legislation is passed for economic stimulus or jobs programs, and one of which the small kitchen cabinet company that I've worked for is involved in and bid on a job for a federal housing rehabilitation project to put new kitchens in. Those jobs pay a living wage, and their guidelines are based on a prevailing rate. The cabinet company is not paying their employees the prevailing rate. It's my understanding that that is the law, but there's no one in that business that's going to open their mouth and say anything about it because their job is on the line, and chances are that they won't be worked. I asked if the job paid a prevailing rate, and I have a job putting finishes on wood, and I was basically passed over to have someone else get the job that they paid a lot less money per hour to than the prevailing rate. Nothing was said. No one reapproached me for assistance on that job, and there was no enforcement of the guideline. There's no auditing of the books of a company. They bid these jobs on a per-bid basis. They get the job on the lowest bid wins the job. And if there's any profit involved in those jobs, the company owner's putting that in his pocket, and the worker's not getting that.
So prevailing wages, prevailing rates should prevail. And when you know of violations and hear of violations, my suggestion is to contact your member of Congress immediately so they can contact the Department of Labor on your behalf so that an investigation can take place. I certainly do that for my constituents, and I would urge you to call your member of Congress and discuss this with him or her, because that is so important that workers be paid a prevailing wage so that people can take care of their families and during this economic crisis, and companies should not get away with cheating our workers.
Next phone call comes from Marcus in Newport News, Virginia. Democrats line.
Yes, how you doing? I'm very nervous, so you have to excuse me. Ms. Barbara Lee, I respect the Congressional Black Caucus and everything they stand for, being a young black male myself. And my call is not on whether Barack Obama is going to make good economic decisions. I'm not the most politically astute, and I'm not very politically educated like some of the prior callers. But as a young black male, and as you being somebody who represents the Young Black Caucus, I want to talk from the perspective of how Barack Obama sees young black males and how he sees himself as a black man, and how that relates to how he might be able to come up with problems that directly affect young black males, such as economics and keeping us off the street and out of gangs. Because when I look at Barack Obama's background as a young black male, it doesn't really seem to fit for what the average black male that I've raised around has been through. I mean, you know, from the background of him being raised in Kansas and, you know, being in Hawaii and going to Harvard. Young black males that I see a lot of times, they strive for those things, but they never seem to get there, and Barack Obama has. So being that he does have a white mother and that he is only half black, and I don't mean to offend the president because I do see him as a black man, I just don't see how a lot of those social ways that he's seen in life and sort of the privileges that he's got from his white side, being that white people do have white privilege in America, how he can directly relate to what the average black male is going through. And why isn't he addressing issues like private-owned prisons, or why isn't he addressing issues that are really, to the effect, should I dare use the word, revolutionary?
All right.
I think that President Barack Obama is a wonderful role model for our young African American men. Secondly, I know that the president gets it. When you look at the president's policies as it relates to the criminal justice system, for example, when you look at the people that he has appointed, such as Attorney General Eric Holder, who understands that the disparities in crack cocaine sentencing and all of the criminal justice disparities significantly, unfortunately, disproportionately affect African American men. The president has put in place people to begin to try to turn this around. It's not going to happen overnight. And I think that President Obama, along with Chairman John Conyers, who chairs the Judiciary Committee, are doing a fine job together to try to begin to unravel some of these very horrible criminal justice policies that have put more resources and a focus more on incarceration rather than prevention, rather than, again, we talked about the dropout rate in young black men. I know the president understands and is working on policies through the Department of Education to try to help our young African American men stay in school. And so this is a big job. He's done a great job. I mean, I think he is beginning to help turn this economy around. He's doing that. His administration is. What we're talking about is trying to make sure that all of the entire country, all the populations in our country really benefit from this economic turnaround. And I believe that young African American men have a wonderful role model to look up to who understands what's taking place in our communities. He worked as an organizer in Chicago. Again, as I said earlier, I know that he gets it.
If he gets it and if he's doing a great job, then why did 10 Congressional Black Caucus members boycott a vote in the House Financial Services Committee? What was the discussion like about deciding, okay, we're not going to go to this vote. We're going to send a message to the White House?
Understand, I said earlier, we're members of Congress, and so we have a responsibility to make sure that our legislative proposals are put into place. Oftentimes, there are ways you have to make sure that happens. And I'm very proud of the fact that 10 members of the Congressional Black Caucus decided that they weren't going to vote on a bill, and they had specific reasons. I don't believe any member has said anything negative about the president. That's primarily been the headlines in the press. What we have talked about is working together with the president to make sure that all of the economic issues, which the Financial Services Committee has jurisdiction over, are addressed in a way that is inclusive and that does not leave anyone behind.
Was there concerns, though, that the White House was not listening enough, and so that prompted the boycott?
Let me first say, I believe what prompted the boycott is very clear in terms of the legislation that the Financial Services Committee members have been working on. I believe that, and again, some of the comments have been, we wanted to make sure, at least the committee members wanted to make sure that the unemployment issues and that the gaps in the economic security of our country was addressed, that minority and women-owned businesses, when you look at the fact that very few contracts are let with African-American and minority-owned companies, when you look at the kinds of dollars that has been spent through the TARP and through the stimulus funding, those issues come through the Financial Services Committee. That's a very important committee in terms of the economic infrastructure of our country and the economic infrastructure of the African-American community. These resources have been slow to get to our communities, and so members of the Financial Services Committee were not only focused on the bill, but talking about really economic empowerment and economic security. Nothing was said in terms of a negative message to the president. What we're talking about is working with the president to make sure that as legislators and as members of Congress, that our policies and our proposals are included in the bills that we are putting forward.
All right, back to phone calls here. Lester, North Carolina. Dean on the Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to first start off by saying that the black guy from Virginia that called in, he sounds like a great American to me. He's center-left, and I'm on the other side. I'm an average white American, center-right, and so I think we're of the same mind. I just got a quick comment. I wonder if there was a Congressional Black Caucus in Congress, can you imagine the outrage across this country?
You want to address that, Congresswoman?
Sure. First, the Congressional Black Caucus was founded 40 years ago, has always been the conscience of the Congress. The Congressional Black Caucus was formed because there were very few representatives as advocates for the African American community and other communities that had been shut out of the political process. Remember, we only received or were granted the right to vote in the mid-'60s. Housing discrimination laws were in effect until the mid-'60s. Jim Crow, segregation, lynching. I remember many times, my dad was a military officer, lieutenant colonel, him wearing his uniform with his 3 girls and my mother, going to restaurants, being told, I'm sorry, but we don't serve, and they'd use the N-word. My dad fought in 2 wars. I could not go to public schools because they were segregated. My mother almost died when she was giving birth to me because the hospital would not admit her because she was black. And so there are many issues that are historical, which are the legacies of slavery and the vestiges of racism that we have to address. And we have to do this in a big way. We work with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, the Blue Dogs, the New Dems. We have specific caucuses in our Congress to address certain issues and certain needs. That's the beauty of democracy and the beauty of our country. And we come together united around President Obama because we want him to succeed, and I think his candidacy showed that the country was moving forward. And we have a lot of work to do to make sure the American dream is real for everyone.
For more information, you can go to the website, thecongressionalblackcaucus.com. Dalton, Georgia. Bob on the Democrats line. Good morning. Good morning.
Yes, I think we have a problem with our government, especially with our civil action lawsuits filed with the EEOC. This is a very high rate problem. I've looked on the internet on several different occasions, and I've seen where people have filed charges with the EEOC, and from my understanding, a lot of these people's constitutional rights have been violated. Not only their constitutional rights, it's that it's mismanaging of documents, which I think the Freedom of Information Act takes care of those situations. But through the situations that they're taking care of, a lot of these documentations that is sent into the EEOC are mishandled. It's fraudulent. Some of the investigations don't go through their investigating procedures. This gives these companies leadway for discriminating and finding ways to discriminate and find it's okay to discriminate. These problems have got to be addressed, and these problems have got to be taken care of.
Congresswoman?
Unfortunately, I believe during the last 8 years under the Bush administration, the EEOC was really dormant. Nothing much was happening in terms of compliance. Finally, we have an administration that is putting together an EEOC now that's going to do their job to ensure equal opportunity for all. But I agree, it's been a problem. The last 8 years have been dismal, and so now I think we're going to, at least I have a ray of hope, that the EEOC is going to turn around and bring some justice to those individuals who have filed complaints.
One last phone call for you here. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Sylvia on the independent line.
Hello. How are you doing this morning?
Sylvia, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. I just want to thank CPAN for allowing individuals to call in from all around the United States. Barbara, my name is Sylvia Kirk, and I live in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and my call is that you and Maxine Waters are doing a great job being members or heading up the Black Caucus there in California. I am concerned. I've been calling in. This makes about my 5th time. It takes about 4 months for me to call in, and I just sit back and watch. But what I'm concerned about is what is individuals, since they have so much to say, so many questions to be answered, what are they going to do about the housing prices, and where are the grants at?
Well, the housing crisis, as we said earlier, has wreaked havoc on the lives of millions of Americans. And thank you for that question, because part of what we're doing as members of the Congressional Black Caucus is we're trying to make sure that the foreclosure crisis is addressed in a big way by making sure that the resources are there for counseling, for assistance with mortgage principal reduction, and for making sure that people can reset their loans. Because, again, I said earlier, the Pew Research showed that, in its studies, showed that the black community and minority communities were targeted for these subprime loans. The only way that people, really the majority of Americans, accumulate wealth to send their kids to college, start a small business, is through the equity in one's home. The African American community, because of the targeting of these scam loans, we're losing our equity, we're losing the ability to live our lives the American way. And so it's very important that all of the measures that we've been talking about, again, going back to the Financial Services Committee, that is the committee that addresses housing policy. And we've got to do more to make sure that people's lives are stabilized and that the housing foreclosure crisis stops. We've got to do it, and we've got to do it in a big way.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thank you for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
When we come back, we'll open up those phone lines and ask you about